But I'd like to ask I'd like to pose as the devil's advocate here and see what our speakers have to say about it. Let's imagine that I'm trying to put forth the neoconservative point of view, and I would say, look, you know, a lot of what you're saying may make some sense under certain circumstances, but there's something unique about the nature of the enemy today, and that would be this, that Islam teaches the necessity of bringing all mankind under the thumb of Islam. Now, whether that's just a radical Islam, whether that's true Islam, is not an issue we need to settle. The point is there are people who believe that is the true Islam. Now, let us suppose that only 0.1% of all Muslims believe that. Well, that's still 1 million people. And so if you have 1 million people who are not afraid of death and so cannot be deterred the way we deterred the Soviets, and so would be prepared to use horrific types of weapons that they could smuggle into our country, how can we sit here and give pretty little speeches about constitutions and liberties and everybody should have the right to just to run around and we shouldn't have the ability to grab them and lock them up when we're dealing with a threat of this sort of nature? I mean, aren't you just burying your heads in the sand? Can't you face this thing head on? I want to know what you guys would say to that.
Well, I think you've posed the question that really needs to be asked is how do we assess threat and danger, because that's the demarcation line between what's justifiable war and what is not. What is the level of threat to the United States sovereignty and what is not? And indeed, when we look at the Constitution for guidance, what does it say? You can suspend the great writ of habeas corpus, the core of liberty, in times of invasion or rebellion. Invasion or rebellion, those two terms. That's why the United States Supreme Court held in the Boumediene case that Congress acted unconstitutionally when it suspended habeas corpus for those detainees at Guantanamo Bay. There's no invasion, there's no rebellion. It doesn't reach that threshold of war, which has to be high. Because war what is the defining element of war? It makes legal what ordinarily is murder, homicide. So it's something that has to be done very carefully. And you know what? This shows the Orwellian sense of where we are now in our legal architecture. If we kill someone who is an enemy combatant or a terrorist suspect, even a U.S. citizen, that's legal. War. They shoot back and kill us, war crime. Terrorism. That's a little bit odd. We ordinarily would call it self-defense, but under our current regime, it's the opposite. But let's ask, what is the danger out there? Because, of course, we don't want to invite. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, is what Justice Robert Jackson once said. What is the element of danger that shows that there's 1 million Islamists out there, radical Islamists, who are ready to attack and invade the United States and perpetrate all these other 9/11? They aren't there. But look at what is the evidence that we have that the danger that's been postulated is like the Soviet Red Army or the Luftwaffe or Hirohito's Zero airplanes. And it's really very, very tiny and fragmented. If we look at the FBI's number of al-Qaeda terrorist cells in the United States, 0. 0 cells in the United States. And moreover, the question is not only whether they're danger, but why isn't our customary criminal law enforcement, which punishes conspiracies, that's danger in their embryonic stages, sufficient to capture, kill if necessary, if they're trying to escape and they're dangerous felons, those who are guilty of criminal offenses? Because every person that you've described, hypothetically, would be guilty of a crime. It's not legal to conspire in or outside the United States to kill Americans. And you can use electronic surveillance. The United States Supreme Court has held the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply outside the United States. You could kidnap them, bring them back in the United States for trial, as was done with Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. It was done in the United States before 9/11. We captured those who were guilty of aircraft hijacking in the Middle East, brought them to the United States, tried them. That was sufficient. Said, well, what about due process? We cannot survive due process. There was a study done by an organization at NYU about how Miranda warnings may have imperiled our ability to investigate terrorism after 9/11, and found that there wasn't a single instance where giving Miranda warnings and due process at all obstructed our ability to investigate and thwart terrorism incidents, because our criminal justice system is very broad. And it doesn't mean that there will never be another attempt at a 9/11. We can't make that risk zero. Remember, there was Timothy McVeigh, too. And when Timothy McVeigh blew up and killed all those at Oklahoma City, I don't know an upstart saying, murder laws don't work. Let's declare war on domestic terrorists. Suspend habeas corpus, go into people's homes without search warrants, arrest anybody without probable cause if you think they might be a terrorist. Even though we did try him, we did convict him, we sentenced him to death. Murder laws are viewed as sufficient even though we have murders. So the argument that, well, all of the efforts prior to 9/11, which we did at the World Trade Center bombings and the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Tanzania, they didn't say, oh, this system's not working because there was still another attack. That's what you can say of every single law that you could ever pass. There are going to be violations from time to time. And you punish the violations. It doesn't mean that you suspend the Constitution. So my answer would be, there isn't even close to a showing that if you look at the actual danger presented by so-called radical Islamists, they are an existential threat to the United States. And you have to combine two elements, I think, Tom, and you only postulated one. You have to combine an intent with an ability to execute. You know, a madman on top of Mount Kilimanjaro could say, we're going to destroy all the United States. We wouldn't go to war in any sense. But even if he had that as the greatest sincere effort that he desired, because he didn't have any capability. There may well be Islamists who have an intent, a desire to destroy the United States. It doesn't mean that they have a ghost of a chance of accomplishing the same. That would be my response.
Okay, would either of you gentlemen like to add something? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there are evil people in the world. There are a lot of evil people in the world. I think the point is we don't destroy our own society and what makes that society worth living in. I'm quite prepared to have somebody come to me and say, the government needs some additional powers, but my view is that it has to be bounded and people have to be held accountable. What really concerns me is that as I look at the Patriot Act and some of the other things that have come out of the war on terror, that there's kind of a grab bag of things that federal officials have wanted for years, and terrorism provides the opportunity to ask for everything. And what was striking to me during the Bush years was the absolute refusal to hold any federal official accountable for their actions in using those powers. Now, if those powers are necessary, fine, but we do not elect a monarch as president. The president is a constitutional officer representing a free republic who must be bounded by the law and held accountable. This is not, and the argument that the only way we can protect ourselves from terrorists is to allow the president to just decide Americans are, enemy combatants, even if arrested in America, and disappear. I mean, this is not that of a republic. And I think the good news is that while there are evil people out there, some of whom are, in fact, Islamic fundamentalists, it turns out it's very hard for them to do what they want, and they don't pose the kind of existential threat that we have lived with. I mean, go back to 1953. There's the Soviet Union headed by Joseph Stalin, one of the great mass murderers in human history. The Red Army is posed in Europe, the North Koreans have invaded South Korea, and Mao Zedong has taken control in China. Two of the Asian landmass now looks communist. Communism is on the march and threatening Europe, which remains war-torn. Japan has been defeated and is pacifist. This is a very frightening world. But this is not a world in which we give up our constitutional liberties. We take measured steps and protect those liberties and hold people accountable when they exercise those powers, and we eliminate those powers whenever they're necessary, when we don't need them anymore. And one of the frightening things I see with the whole issue of the war on terror is it never ends. What is being demanded is to treat the United States proper as a battlefield in a war that will never be declared over, and to argue that the president's wartime powers usable in the American homeland during this time transcend the Constitution. And that is really what was argued during the Bush years. The president has unique wartime powers that are not bounded by any constitutional accountability, and that is frightening in terms of what America really is. And I would argue that's not necessary to deal with terrorism. Terrorism is a threat, but it's a bounded, measured threat. We need to deal with it and confront it, but let's confront it within the realm of law and the Constitution. Let's not throw out the constitutional law, which is the basis of this country.